After the Germans lost World War II, the victorious Allies divided Germany into four sectors: the French sector, the Soviet sector, the American sector, and the British sector. The Americans, the French, and the British held West Berlin, but it was deep into the Soviet zone of Germany. The French, Americans, and the British united their German zones to try to form a strong Germany. The Soviets did not agree, as they did not want to have a strong Germany that they would have to fight another war with. So the Russians shipped the people and scientists of East Germany back to Russia to work.
The Americans and the Allies had a lot of work to do to keep West Berlin going because, pre-war, Berlin had a population of over 4.5 million people. After the devastation of World War II, only 28.5% of the workforce remained. 3/4 of the housing space had been destroyed, and Berlin could only produce 2% of the food needed for them to survive. The city was vulnerable, always teetering on the edge of the tragedy of starvation.
Additionally, West Berlin was at risk because the desperately needed supplies from the Allies could be cut off at any point. The only guaranteed route into West Berlin through the Soviet territory was via 3 air channels. This agreement had been negotiated earlier, but the land routes never were secured. From 1945 to 1946, the Allies could have negotiated rights to enter Berlin by vehicle or foot, but they didn't. This meant that the Allies could not enter Berlin by means other than plane. Because of this treaty, the Soviets could not shoot down any of the planes passing their border through the agreed channels, but could kill any Allies entering Berlin by vehicle, foot, or any other means of transportation. The Soviets harassed them, however, by shining spotlights at the planes in attempts to blind their pilots.
The Germans were about to have an election, so William Pike, the leader of the Communist group of Germany, talked with the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin. They decided that if the Allied political opponents were gone, the Communist group might win the election, thus turning Germany into a communist country, and therefore taking control of much of Europe. With that thought and the breakdown between former Allies and the Soviet Union, the decision was made to move against Berlin and possibly, triumphantly, gain control of more of Germany and ultimately more of Western Europe. The Russians would act, but not with outright war.
The Russians imposed a blockade on Berlin in June of 1948, removing railroad tracks and putting roadblocks on the road because they wanted control of West Berlin. The U.S. responded immediately by launching Operation Planefare, a huge operation that flew supplies into Berlin via airplanes. The airplanes flew through 3 flight paths agreed upon by the Soviets to West Berlin, where they landed at Rheinmain or Wiesbaden and unloaded their cargo. The West Berlin population of 2.8 million people was kept alive for 321 days.
At the height of Operation Planefare on April 16, 1948, an Allied aircraft landed in Berlin every minute with over 1,000 flights. In just 24 hours, carrying about 13,000 tons of goods, coal, and machinery. Needless to say, this was one of the most important days of the airlift. Over 278,000 flights were made, and 2,326,400 tons of food and supplies were delivered to Berlin. The Allies flew coal, food, sanitary items, machinery, and anything else needed to keep the West Berliners alive during the blockade. They carried coal in inexpensive duffel bags, which they bought from the army. The airmen also lifted sick children out of Berlin and brought them to American hospitals so that they could be helped more medically than they could have been in Berlin.
A pilot named Lieutenant Gale Halverson came up with an idea to drop candy to the children of Berlin, earning him the nickname Uncle Wiggly Wings because he would wiggle his airplane's wings as a salute to the children so they knew he was about to drop candy. 31 Americans, 39 Britons, and 8 Germans lost their lives in airlift operations. A plane that was landing missed the runway and crashed into a tree. Its British crew escaped, but the newly formed Air Force, which was flying the supplies in, was more careful in the future. Without the Allies flying them food and supplies, the people of West Berlin would have died.
On April 4, 1949, the Western powers signed the North Atlantic Treaty founding NATO. An attack on any one of them would be considered an attack on them all. The blockade ended on Wednesday, May 11, 1949. The Russians withdrew from Berlin the next day, and the West Berliners were safe. The Allies kept sending food and supplies until the Berliners could take care of themselves. If the Soviets had come back, the Allies would have had a month to negotiate the Soviets out of Berlin, while extra food and supplies from the airlift was in Berlin fed the whole population during that time. During the airlift, it was a very sad and hard time for the Berliners, but the triumph was great. It showed the West Berliners that the Allies were good because they had kept the people of Berlin alive for over 300 days, even though they had fought each other in World War II.
In late 1948, both East and West Berlin had established separate governments. Each part of the city had its own police, currency, and public utility system. Most East or West Berliners were shocked by this segregation, but few were brave enough to smuggle goods into both parts of the city, which wasn't very hard to do, because as soon as they were on the other side of the border, only the occupiers of that part of the city could harm them. Sometimes the border between two parts of the city were the yellow lines in the middle of the street. Life was very difficult for the Berliners, and they would have perished if not for the airlift.
Even though it is very tragic that around 80 human lives were lost because of this operation, it was triumphant that the Berlin airlift saved millions from starvation and deprivation of supplies. The two superpowers, the US and the USSR, had faced off in the first potentially tragic confrontation of the Cold War. Each country possessed the atomic bomb and the potential to destroy each other. The focus of the confrontation was the future of Berlin, Germany. The triumphant winner would gain control of Germany and possibly much of Europe. As we know, the Communist group did not win the election, and the Allies created the first democratic Republic of Germany.